Hi, and welcome to Decoding AQ, helping you to learn the tools, mindsets, and actions to thrive in an ever-changing world. Hi, and welcome. I'm so excited to be joined today by Nicola Strong. She's a coach, explorer, learning expert, and I had the pleasure of first meeting and sharing a lovely dinner after CogX in London. And then Nicola kindly came and sat on our panel in our June event called Unlearn, and we've been getting to know each other. So welcome.
Thank you, Ross.
So I always like to start off with a little bit of a journey that people have been on. And for you, I think what intrigues me was some decades ago, shall we say, you studied change agent and skills and strategies. I believe that was at Surrey University. And
Yes,
I just wanted to kind of start there as, what was that? Was that something quite pioneering at the time? It had been running for a while. Give me a little bit of context to where that started at university for you.
I was introduced to the Change Agent Skills and Strategies Masters by a very good friend of mine who said to me, this is life-changing. It's a really robust degree and it will give you, I think, he said, a sort of good grounding in what is considered to be good models and theories and practices in change management. So I thought to myself, let's do it. And I found myself experiencing, I think, probably one of the most important lessons, and that was what it actually felt like to change. So what I was inviting other people to do was to do something that perhaps I hadn't actually really experienced myself. So I was made to experience change while doing the degree, and then obviously reflect on that with my fellow participants. And that I thought was really valuable. And I think it brought a sort of grounded, guiding sort of clarity to what I thought was intuitively right. And I think it gave me a much better idea about how to support people through change.
I love that. I like this balance between, the academic world that looks at theory and then learn by doing, and the practical application, and this perhaps opportunity you had of experiencing what you were learning about by the journey that you were taking in doing it is quite a nice, subtle piece to recognize and reflect on that. And I'm interested, in terms of how this has shaped perhaps your thinking since then. So you went, you experienced, as many of us do. We go into, our careers being led from an academic start point. How has that shaped? And if it didn't, why?
I think it did. I think I have and it was a tough journey, I have to say. I have a sort of better awareness than I had of biases, of boundaries of knowing, of paradigms and paradigm shifts. And I think when you're asking people to adapt, when you're asking people to make change in their lives or in their work, it's about having that awareness. So that, I think, was very valuable and has definitely made a difference to the way I work.
Have you seen in these, last couple of decades, a difference that has come about because of technology? So we hear a lot in the media, and I've certainly experienced this acceleration that's coming about because of everything being digitized. Oh, we've got our digital strategy, all of these pieces that are affecting every area of work. How have you seen that evolve and change?
Well, I started off working as a trainer, facilitator, and an enthusiast in change rather than a change agent. And I've certainly in my world have seen a dramatic change in terms of the way people learn. Obviously, I started off with lots of face-to-face work. I would do courses that were 5 days long. But of course, I got much more interested in virtual teams and remote teams, and there was an isolation in that. And I think what technology has done, of course, on the positive side, is bring people together, allow for more of a community of practice, a sort of hive thinking to happen. And I think that's very, very exciting, but it's not necessarily something that we would have done perhaps just even 10 years ago. So I think it's revolutionized the sort of accessibility and the personalization of learning and communicating, involving much larger numbers of people. And I like that because it brings an inclusion into the sort of paradigm of what learning is. So yes, there's been a huge change, and I know a lot of people have questioned it, but I think I've seen lots of good things that have come out of it.
A lot of these aspects are about our own perception and mindset of things. Whilst digital technology can be the reason why change is happening, it can also be the tool and support to deal with that change. So whether that change requires new learning and digital can be part of how that's deployed is quite an interesting point in itself, isn't it? By the activity of it existing requires change, and then it enabling that change to take place in somebody. In terms of where you touched on there about training and learning and that aspect of change and adaptation, what's your kind of views of what are we going to expect? So we've done this little quick visit to our past that has brought us to today. But if we took a view of the next few years, and you've done a fair bit of research in this, I know, which we'll get to in a bit, but what's your vision of tomorrow in terms of how these tools and how digitization is affecting coaching, learning, training, those areas?
I'm with Professor David Clutterbuck on this one. I know there's an interest in say having totally autonomous systems that are our assistant or our coaches as an isolated entity, but I think that'll swing back once we've visited that sort of end of pendulum swing to something that it'll be far more augmented. So there will be coaches who will, I suppose, augment their practice with supportive autonomous systems of some sort. And I think that's a much healthier from my own point of view in terms of how we're implementing AI. And I'm very excited about AI and artificial intelligence and all the sort of various digital options that we have available to us. I do, however, think that we are going to be augmenting rather than going autonomous.
Interesting. And I think you describe this pendulum shift, and I see that a lot in terms of we have to go and explore the edge and the fringe to then realize, is that the place we want to be? So just because we can automate something or we pursue to expand that to replace, we then find, do we want to? It might be because it relates to the outcome, so augmenting might deliver a better outcome, but it can also be about choosing how we want to do this, how we as a recipient want to learn, and how a knowledge entity, human or machine, chooses to deliver that. And I think that's a key part of the future for me anyway.
I so agree with you, Ross. I really do. There are some things that I've been looking at where actually it's quite interesting. I used to look at people, eyeball to eyeball, and we'd have a conversation. Coaching would be all about listening to somebody with full attention and looking at them with that curiosity, with that interest. Well, of course, now we're seeing the eyeball purely as a mechanism of accessing the mind.
Yeah.
So it's quite interesting how we've transferred our focus from the sort of normal human interfaces into things that are far more penetrating.
And trying to look deeper, I guess.
Yes.
If it is truly the window to our souls, if that's via the mind, and we're trying to discover and understand a little bit more of what influences us to believe certain things, have certain mindsets, and evolve through these transitions of thriving and survival, through growth and coping, all of those lovely little moments in the ribbon of change, from anxiety to excitement and everything in the mix. I'm fascinated to get this opportunity to share with some of our listeners about your research, and particularly in the area of chatbots. These have become something that I'm sure many of our audience have experienced, and they'll have their opinion of, very bad experiences and maybe some surprising ones. And of course, technology is accelerating. What I'm interested in is this difference between chatbots, where it might have been deployed early by organizations in customer services in sort of a replacement of the FAQ and question and answer kind of process, into more coaching. So can you tell us and share us a little bit more about what the research was, what maybe some of the highlights of that are, and what we can learn from what you've discovered?
I think my sort of research has I have various pockets of curiosity that I follow and sort of delve into and wander around in. I think it started off when I had to do a talk for the Association for Business Psychology, and they asked me to do a talk, and I said, well, okay, then I'll do one on if a robot had a personality, would it improve our productivity?
Nice.
And
Yeah.
that I thought was sort of pretty important, because that's where the focus is for me. And then I thought, I got more curious about, well, okay, then if we look at, say, Heather Knight's work around robots and comedy, she did some really exciting work around that. And she was looking at robots and AI reading humans' behavior. And she was saying things like human behavior tracking, body language, behavior systems, task-based interactions, gaze, personality. They were all things that
could be decoded.
Be decoded in some form.
Yeah.
And then I thought, well, actually, I need to do the same with humans. How do humans read an AI or robot? And I thought to myself, well, of course, there's work being done around the uncanny valley, you know, how we visually perceive a system, how it moves, how confident we feel the way it moves around, whether it really understands us, whether it could make sense of us, whether it could demonstrate an understanding of who we are, and what sort of intelligence it would display. Did it have any common sense? And was it safe to work with? I think some of the robots that I had stood next to in presentations, people found alarming or frightening.
Yeah.
And then, of course, obviously its functionality and its level autonomy. And of course, you've got the Sheridan model around to what extent the bot or the autonomous system is in charge. So I sort of looked at those two areas where an AI is looking at a human and where a human's looking at an AI. And that, I think, really started to sort of resonate in terms of where I went in further research. So then looking at the wider landscape, and I do recommend for people to look at some of the fascinating research that's being done and some of the products that are now available to all of us. You can see how they're using elements of that to try and build the relationship, the coaching relationship, in a way that the human then feels supported, because that's what it's all about. That's what you're trying to achieve. And of course, with that in mind, I've been working with a wonderful chap in South Africa, Dr. Nikki Terblain, and he's been working on a chatbot called Vicky. She's, and I call her she, isn't that interesting? Probably because of the name.
I'd be interested, you know, has anybody done any research into the names and personalities of chatbots?
Yes.
And how many of them are female? Because everyone I seem to come across appears to be a female. You know, they have female names. Amber, you know, the chatbot with AXA, you mentioned Vicky, you know, we've been working on one that our working title is Ada, you know. That's just an interesting slight segue, but yeah.
Definitely, and there are some people that have real issues around that, around gender and chatbot, voices, their demeanor, their language, and of course, obviously, their name. So that's a huge conversation that perhaps we must have on another occasion.
Yeah.
What Vicky is doing is she's looking, or rather she is as a coach, she's an e-coach. So she's looking at conversation. She's looking at ways that she can support you in a traditional coaching scenario. She's right at the beginning of her research. So Nikki, who has been developing this, and I mean, he's been working in this area for some years. He's a coach, professional coach at the University of Stellenbosch in South Africa. So he's very keen that Vicky has a truly coaching behavior as such, or say a series of behaviors. So that's very exciting. Would recommend you exploring that. I know he's coming up to Vicky 3.0.
Okay. Yeah.
Another one which I've been exploring is the Echo Borg, or I Am Echo Borg, which is a conversational bot. And I Am Echo Borg is much more philosophical. So it's supposed to be a recruitment bot, but in fact, the person speaking to this particular AI is invited to consider the philosophy of life, to consider the relationship with humans and intelligent machines. So it's taking a far more sort of interested conversation in value sets, in the philosophy of life, in humanity. So I've been experimenting with that too. And I think also working with, say, some of the guys at Saberr, I've been very curious to see how Saberr and CoachBot is working in organizations now, developing a
Yep.
team coaching bot. So yeah, quite a variety, quite a few
I want
pockets
to
of
pick up on
curiosity.
the Echo Bot piece, because I had the opportunity at an event that we were both at in London, the AI and robotics conference, and it was fascinating to see what kind of person turned up in the interview. So we had the audience and they would go and be interviewed by this AI. And of course, you might know that person, Dave or Peter or Sally or whoever who goes up. And do they behave as they would towards me or towards someone else? Or are they manifesting a part and a side of their personality because they feel that's either what's expected or they want to test the system in a different way? So I found some of them being very rude and obtuse, and a way in which I would be so cringing if it was another human on the other side. I'm thinking, how can you speak to someone like that? You know, because I'm putting the emotional feelings in the machine, in the AI, on their behalf, and thinking, God, you're rude, I'd send you home. And on the other side, people who showed compassion, irrelevant of whether it was a human, just show compassion because that's who they wanted to be and how they wanted to behave. And so I found, you know, coming back to your first comment, it's not just about how the AI interacts with us, it's how do we interact with it. That are two very interesting viewpoints of that. And I guess that balance of, we talk about ethics a lot in AI and how do we build ethical AI. What I observed in that example was unethical behavior in the human towards AI. And what some of the dangers of that are is if we're using every interaction as a learning point, not just from the databases that we give it and the curriculum we give it, but how people interact with that, that's an interesting part of the journey, I guess, with coaching specifically and with these e-coaches, as you put it.
I think you make a really important point. I think we do need to think about how we interact with these systems, because they are remembering, they're recording
Yep.
every type of way that we're talking to, not just what we say. And I can assume that they're only listening to the text of my conversation with you now. I have a feeling that, you know, very soon we're going to be looking at intonation, we're going to be looking at the sort of language, the way that I speak. It's all part of the way I am, and that's what they're seeking to understand.
Yeah.
So I think we do need to be more patient with these new systems and understand that it is going to use every piece of data it can in order to respond.
Yeah.
And I am worried about that. One of the areas that I found really interesting, in a sort of almost continuing on the sort of research element, is I've been curious about how you can support people with disabilities, and in some ways the ethical challenges and accessibility challenges, and that sort of the information that the system receives from somebody can sometimes be seen as an anomaly. So somebody who's trying to interact with a system who may not in fact be able to speak clearly, or has maybe not a facial expression that could normally be read by a facial recognition system, or may only have a limited number of words available to them in their vocabulary. will all have an impact around how we're using AI for people with disability. And I think it's so important to value somebody's difference in that way and to respond to it. But at the same time, you need a lot of data
Yeah.
to do that, which means you're going straight into the sort of GDPR and privacy issues. You're going into a whole load of sensitive data that you wouldn't normally draw from somebody. And I think that conversation must be had soon. I think Scope, the charity Scope, are looking at this in their big hack.
Yep.
And I'm really excited and I'm supportive of their work there. That conversation has to happen.
It
now.
does.
Yeah.
And I think it's also each individual's responsibility to behave in a manner appropriate. You know, I find it fascinating, you know, when I communicate with Alexa, for example, I'll be saying please and thank you. Because that's how I was brought up. You know, my parents taught me that's the way you communicate. And I've said before in a couple of other podcasts, you know, I have a different voice when I'm talking to my pet dogs, to my nan, to my wife, to other people. My, as you said, intonation changes, the language I use changes because it's contextually aware. And I think we have a responsibility when we are interacting with technology to think about it as how would I interact with my child or my grandchild? What is appropriate or not appropriate because it's learning from me. And if it's not just the responsibility of the builders, it's the responsibility of the users because they are part of its education system. And so I think that is an interesting future that I see about the ethics, in that if we view it as a child, how would you treat that? If it was a vulnerable individual that doesn't know right from wrong, how do you help it? Not just rely on the creators at the beginning. So I think that's, you know, perhaps a whole big conversation we could have about
yes.
there.
Conversation number two.
Number two, yeah, take note. I'm interested to see and share where today are we getting some successes? Where are, you know, digitized versions of coaching, and we've been talking about chatbots in particular, are helping their audiences, helping employees, and what could we take away if we're in a company that we want to maybe give more accessibility, more reach, more support. They're seeing stress and impact of change, and they want to leverage the training and coaching opportunities of these. Who would they look to? What's working well? Maybe you could share a couple of stories or examples there.
So you're after a particular product or particular chatbot?
Any company, anywhere where perhaps you've seen through your research or your observations where it's benefiting employees using these types of technologies. I think would be great to hear if you've got any examples.
Yeah, sure. The one that I am really impressed with actually is Saberr's CoachBot. I know they're working in NatWest, Siemens, KPMG and Vodafone. And what they're doing is they are a typical CoachBot that's augmenting the professional coaches. In the banking area, I know what CoachBot has been doing is looking at team performance. So how they do it is that they invite the bot will be informed of all the people involved in the team, and the bot will send out messages inviting them to make it clear what they want from learning, or make it clear what they want from working together in the team, or developing values. So essentially the bot collates all the data that the team thinks it would like to talk about. It will then assimilate that, send it off to the coach. The coach will then review that, and it will inform the coach on how to make the next team intervention. Once the coach, and we're talking about human coach here, once the human coach has decided where they think the focus could be, it will then they will then send a message out to all of the team, who can again, simulate any data that they think might be useful to the coach in looking after their interests. So there's a lovely sort of symmetry between the human coach wanting to support the team and a sort of ongoing support that the CoachBot can bring to the team in their day-to-day activities around how they align that to the values of the organization. And it's been hugely successful. It's improved team performance, it's improved clarity of expectations, it's improved the overall team dynamic. So there's a real sort of ongoing feedback mechanism
Yep.
that was missing before in perhaps some of the team coaching that was done just face to face.
I think that's an interesting part of this future that we're going to adapt to and change to, where we are augmenting human and technology together and recognizing the unique abilities of both. And the example you gave there, where perhaps technology can do a gathering and the filtering, and then allow the human to then be more effective rather than overworked, overwhelmed and diluted. It reminds me of a similar piece that AXA in Malaysia did with a chatbot called Amber. And what their challenges was they had a very high, HRBP ratio, in terms of the number of business partners in HR per employee. I think it was well over 400 employees per HR business partner. So their ability to know who was at risk from change, from issues, from any support that was needed was very hard. And their sort of sporadic pulse surveys or these types of things that might try and capture it, a lot was going through the gaps and they weren't being able to do it, yet they had those limited resources. And their CoachBot wasn't a CoachBot as such. All it really was using AI to get that, as you put, feedback loop. So it was sentiment analysis that then allowed to effectively categorize those that it felt were at risk. So it was then a kind of a 1:11 ratio that people and the human part could go in and put the interventions in. So rather than the technology trying to do the interventions at this stage, it was being able to just understand that. And they had some huge benefits that they talked about in terms of retaining a massive proportion of employees who were predicted at risk. Risk from burnout, stress, overwhelm, needing support to going through that transition that was happening. And so I think that's an interesting part, isn't it, as we go through this evolutionary journey where the pendulum at one end is fully augmented, and autonomous, to where we both perhaps believe it should be, which is in partnership and in harmony with. Those things. I'd love to sort of close out and round out on a couple of areas if I can. We touched on this balance between how not only technology evolves, but how we as humans evolve in a technically driven world, in a technology driven world. What are the key aspects that you see around adaptability that is the best of humans and that they can work on? In our pre-conversation, we talked about resilience. I felt I picked up a bit of cold on the train in London yesterday, and you said, that'll build up your resilience for Christmas, and these types of things. What things around the human side can our audience maybe focus on and work on to help prepare them for what's coming ahead, in your view?
And in other words, is that in terms of the augmented coaching? Or
yeah, so if that's coming, and we're now going to face a future where there's going to be more digital coaches and e-coaches, how might I prepare myself for that? How might I prepare my workforce for it? How might I start to think about what I should be doing? You mentioned curiosity and look at the research or these bits. What could I practically do to help me understand what's happening, how I can think about what's even possible with these types of tools that are out there?
Well, I mean, you've already, I think, said some key ones. I think resilience. I think there's a frame of mind here.
Okay.
I think the idea of being open and having a mindset where you're perhaps open to an unusual way of doing something. So the idea of following a process or a procedure is less likely these days. We're much more likely to need to be able to have a sort of ability to see through current perceptions about how the world works. I think sort of optimism. I think there's an awful lot that's being said, and this is a very much a Western view. You know, the East doesn't have so much of this view with technology. An optimism for what technology can do, an optimism for what we can do as humans. I think that's important, and to be open to notice that.
So
And
perhaps then,
sorry,
you
yes.
know, mindset is key. Be open, you know, be curious, have hope and optimism. They're really great ways that they can, you know, someone can show up. If someone was a HR leader, you know, and they were hearing this and going, oh, wow, that's interesting. I hadn't even come across these e-coaches or, you know, what was possible in these chatbots. How, you know, what sort of tips or advice to get started would you give them in these technologies? Is it read this paper, read this article, or go and play with this particular online tool? Where might they begin that journey?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked me this question before, because it is actually quite a deep question. I think
Mhm.
there are some couple of things that I think would be useful. I'm of the view that if you ask somebody, the person whom you want to support, what they are doing already for themselves, are they using any support tools already? That would give them a very good idea of to what extent their staff or their team are already open to this sort of tool or platform. I think it's also worth looking at the current coaching landscape. There's a lot going on in the sort of professional coaching arena around this now. There's a lot of movement and curiosity and papers, so certainly some research around there. So talk to your team and ask them where they're at. Have a look at the coaching landscape. And the last one is, of course, digital chatbots are changing all the time. There's new things coming in with extraordinarily exciting ways of seeing life. And so I would recommend, at the moment when you're ready, when you have that idea of where you think you're coming from, it's worth looking at the landscape to see where you're going to. The other thing, on a practical note, I would have in mind the digital platform and the longevity of it. They're changing all the time. They're being bought out. They're being updated. Their usefulness has changed. Their their level of
Ubiquitous. Yeah.
level of connectivity. Thank you. Is changing all the time. So
Yeah.
it's worth looking at how sustainable your digital platform is. I would also be curious about the values, the biases, the cultural norms of your organization. Which of those you feel are important, and those that you perhaps would want to not pursue, because those will be elongated, they'll be exposed, they'll be stretched by the digital system, and the awareness of that will be useful. I would also be mindful of the accountability issues when implementing a CoachBot, where the accountability sits. Does it
It's a
sit
great
with the
point.
organization? Does
Yeah.
it sit with the organization? Does it sit with the individual? Does it sit with the data holder? Does it sit with the health and safety officer? There's some really important questions around that. And I think finally, with the sort of increased importance of understanding GDPR and the privacy of data and the dangers of losing that data, I'd have a quick look at what your company policies are around data security and the relationship you'd have with the CoachBot and the personalization issues that might come out of that.
It's a great list, and I think it's a reflection of where we're at in the phase, that there's perhaps more questions than answers at the moment. And for me, it's around this is for the pioneers at the moment. You know, it's in the deceptive and the disruptive kind of phase before it then becomes hugely accessible and democratized, that anyone can use it with all of those things taken care of. So I would encourage people to have the conversation, as you said, ask the questions, listen to what's happening at the moment. And as always, from my perspective, if we want to improve something, we have to measure it. So a key component of that for us is measuring the aspects of adaptability and of change to be able to deploy it in the right way. It's been a real pleasure. If people want to look you up, you're on LinkedIn as Nicola Strong, an amazing speaker and curator of research and this harmony that we're building between technology and humans, and helping us all create the sort of environments we want to be part of. I've really enjoyed it, and I look forward to seeing you again very soon. And just a thank you and a virtual handshake before the haptics come in. So thank you.
Ross, thank you very much for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to chat with you. I always have an interesting conversation. So yeah, thank you very much again.
Do you have the level of adaptability to survive and thrive the rapid changes ahead? Has your resilience got more comeback than a yo-yo? Do you have the ability to unlearn in order to reskill, upskill and break through? Find out today and uncover your adaptability profile and score, your AQ. Visit aqai.io to gain your personalised report across 15 scientifically validated dimensions of adaptability. For a limited time, enter code PODCAST65 for a complimentary AQ-Me assessment. AQAI, transforming the way people, teams and organisations navigate change. Thank you for listening to this episode of Decoding AQ. Please make sure you subscribe on your favourite podcast directory, and we'd love to hear your feedback. Please do leave a review and be sure to tune in next time for more insights from our amazing guests.